Thank you all so much for joining us wherever you're watching us tonight.
Robert, let's start with you. You heard in the documentary there, Portlanders are compassionate, but, and perhaps as well as Lentz and yours, what could we do tomorrow? What could happen to improve things?
Well, we earned the title of the largest homeless camp in America, and a large portion of that was in Lentz, and we've seen a dramatic reduction as policies have shifted and resources have been allocated to clean up a lot of the destructive kind of footprint that happens in green areas. As far as what can be done to move forward, I know in my community a sense of accountability is a big deal. If I have a crack in the sidewalk, I can be sued. If they dump heroin needles in my yard and my kid gets stuck, I can do nothing. And I think trying to find an accountability mechanism to mitigate that, because it's going to happen. There's a bunch of heroin junkies out there, other junkies, but they're not, excuse me, I don't want to act like they're the whole population, because they're not, but that impact I think is one of the worst. The derelict RVs, the car campers, plus the tent campers along our school routes and next to our parks. As we apply more services and more accountability to those, I think that helps the problem dramatically.
Yeah, it might be a smaller portion of the population, but certainly having a huge impact in the Lentz area.
Absolutely.
And also, it's not just Lentz. People all across the city are certainly feeling this. And we worked with a research company called DHM to do a survey of Portland residents and try to get their feelings about what they thought about this homeless issue in Portland. And we'll share those results throughout this discussion. And we want to start with some stats about how often people see homelessness in Portland. Just how visible is this? 46% of people told us they see someone living in a tent every day. 42% see someone panhandling every day. On average, people see tent camping 5 times a week. So again, a very visible issue in Portland.
Our survey also found that people are not satisfied with how public officials are responding to this situation. Only 18% satisfied with Ted Wheeler, about the same for County Chairwoman Deborah Kafoury. 31% are satisfied with Police Bureau, and it's the same for the job we as the news media are doing. So Mark, let's start with this. We know a lot of people are trying to help improve this situation. How do you change the perception?
Well, I think it's important to communicate effectively about what is happening out there, the kinds of steps that the city and the county have taken, especially over the last 18 months, to try to make a really difficult situation better, both for the folks who are sleeping outside and also for the housed neighbors who are impacted by the amount of camping activity that we're seeing. Specifically, we've doubled the number of shelter beds that are available in our community over the last 18 months. And we've made that shelter that addresses some of the concerns you heard in your piece that folks have about coming in. We now have a couple shelter, for example, so people can come in with their partners. The shelters we've opened accept animals, and people can bring their possessions. And as a result, we've seen twice as many chronically homeless, long-term homeless folks with disabilities in our shelters as we had a year ago. Over 8,000 people, more than 4,000 more than 3 years ago, went through shelter last year because of these additional changes. Those are short-term. Those are short-term interventions, shelter. The next step is ensuring the access to permanent housing. And there, too, we've been able to make some significant gains.
Let's talk a little bit more about those shelter beds, because we did hear quite a bit about that from the people who are living in the tents. In fact, almost 9 out of 10 of them said, I'd rather stay in the tent than go into a shelter. Will, I know you work very closely trying to get people into shelters. What do you say to someone like that? No thanks, I'll stay here.
Really, we're trying very hard to get people into permanent housing.
Of course you are, but a shelter's one step.
Shelter may be one step. It's not the only route into housing, and Join does a lot of our work directly from street into housing. What we hear from people in terms of their stories on shelter are exactly what they told you in your piece. But one aspect of this that even Olive Marks and the county's investment can't quite quantify is some of these folks have real privacy issues, some related to physical and health issues. Some with Crohn's disease that might have loose bowels, that might soil the bed, that might be stuck in the bathroom when the shelter closes and shelter staff don't know how to deal. I mean, there are additional capacity issues that a shelter system does need to address in terms of some of those real personally felt issues. And I think there's, lingering, even the work that's been done, lingering perceptions of shelters as places you get sick. Places without privacy, places where your belongings are stolen rather than safe, places where you're not safe. So That's the perception that still exists.
It almost seems like there's a desire to leapfrog the shelter into a permanent facility. What does this say about our effort with shelters, Heather?
Well, I mean, I think, you know, given the choice, if one of the questions people were asked is housing an option, if you wanted to move into housing instead of going to a shelter, I imagine the answer would be, yes, I would like to move into housing as opposed to going to a shelter. The reality is there's just not enough housing for folks who are, you know, who are homeless and don't have very much income. And one of the things that we talk about too that works really well for people who are sleeping outside and perhaps in tents is supportive housing, because you know, some of these folks have been in housing before, but they may not have been successful because they may not have had the right services with them. And even the folks who are using, and even the folks who have addiction issues, there are services available, but without the housing, they're not going to be successful with those services. And without the services, they're not going to be successful without that housing.
Could I inject one thing?
Absolutely.
You had touched on like the perception from the population to what's happening, and we hear this as a population. We hear we're spending all this money, it's for housing, it's for homeless, it's for homeless. And I think that's where the breakdown is. What is our government doing? They're putting a ton of money into housing and homeless, and we're not really seeing the law enforcement side, and that's just starting. But you know, our law enforcement is horribly understaffed, and we, you know, impacted communities that see our things being stolen and whatnot would like to see more law enforcement, and we don't hear that. We hear all this money given to housing. I think that generates frustration. Not that it's not well spent, but that it generates frustration. And if the local representatives can kind of tell the public what they're doing to keep our neighborhoods safe, given what's happening, I think that would go a long way.
Well, I think communication is the key, and there is a difference between short-term, you know, dealing with the situation and then the long-term solutions. Voters last November did pass a $250 million bond to create more sustainable housing in Portland. Should that go to supportive housing?
I think 300 units will go towards supportive housing, which is great. And the county has committed services to go along with those units. And that's the kind of collaboration that needs to happen. And although money has been committed to housing, we estimate the community needs about 2,000 units of supportive housing, which is a little bit more expensive, but it's only $53 a night.
But more successful, I would assume, in the long run.
The outcomes are amazing, not only in reductions of homelessness, but reductions in emergency visit stays, reductions in jail stays, reductions in first responders having to work with folks who are sleeping outside.
So the DHM research survey also found that 60% of Portlanders think that allowing tent camping encourages people to stay on the streets rather than seeking permanent housing. It seems to have become a viable option for people living on the streets. This is something I can do, and yes, I might have to move along every now and then, but as we heard from them, it's a better option than staying in a shelter. So how do we get past that? Well, do you think that's true, first of all?
Well, I think you heard it from the folks who were talking about their experience. It's not a desirable way to live, and they would like a better option. And I think the discussion about shelter for some of those folks, a better shelter, a 24-hour shelter where they've got a reserved bed, it will work for them, and they'll come inside, and we've seen that happen. And for others, it is going to be about finding that permanent housing solution for them. There are beyond that limited options for folks. So I think it isn't that people enjoy living in tents or want to be out there living in their tents. It is the absence of an identifiable alternative at the moment, and that's the work we all have to do, is help them find those alternatives.
Go ahead, Will.
Well, there is no doubt that shelters provide a crucial link in our entire system, and Join has a new program reaching out homeless services to housing placement services to shelters and safety off the street locations like Right to Dream 2 and Dignity Village. So there's a way that the system is doing a lot more to make sure that our shelters are not only in better serve the needs of the folks that are interested, but also are being transitional places of safety into permanent housing.
But isn't Right to Dream 2, aren't most of those occupants there 2 to 3 years plus?
Right to Dream 2 is really a transitional space, right? So there's no permanent. There's a community of permanent residents that is helping run the community. It's a lot of work, but a lot of those folks that are there for the night, and it's a nightly shelter space, not a long-term space. Dignity Village has some additional residents with a little more intentional community. It's a different model, but I think one of the short-term solutions is is maybe some additional approach on that front in terms of regulated sites.
Robert, you're going to have to sit on our side if you start asking the questions.
Sorry.
That's all I'm saying. You're going to have to come over here, and you're welcome to join us.
But it's excellent programs he's talking about, but I understood that, and I said the wrong one, that Dignity Village has a long-term population. If that's how we're going to house people, then we need to address that as an alternative and find ways for the city to make that okay. Because right now, if you set up a bunch of shacks, you're going to have code issues. And there is a successful model that's working that is the kind of thing I'd like to see more of.
The tiny homes in Kenton neighborhood,
Correct.
is that what you're thinking about? Yeah. Well, let's talk about that a little bit. What kind of lessons have we learned from that project where it's strictly for women, right? Set up with tiny homes in that area as transition. Do you guys have some thoughts about whether that's good or not?
So there are a number of things we've learned from that.
Okay.
One that's important, I think, and it was reflected in the survey data that you talked about, is the willingness of communities to embrace solutions if they're included in the process. So the Kenton neighborhood actually welcomed Kenton Village in. And Kenton Village is 14 women who are still experiencing homelessness. That community really functions as an alternative kind of shelter. The idea is not for anyone to live there long term. Right. And because of that, we've been very intentional about attaching support services to that village.
They go right to the village.
That's right. They come on site into the village and work with the women as soon as they move in to start the process of moving out into true permanent housing. So we know that with the right support services, whether it's Dignity Village or Right to Dream, those sheltering strategies, those sheltering communities can be truly transitional and help people obtain a little bit of stability while they're working on getting back into permanent housing.
A little bit at a time.
A little bit at a time.
All right. We're going to take a quick break and come back with more questions about what we can do as a city to really improve this situation.
For those of you who are just joining us, thanks so much. I'm Kyle Aboshi. This is Maggie Vespa. We're part of the entire investigative team, many others as well, who participated in this. Looking at Tent City USA, a project which we started roughly 3 months ago to get a better understanding of the problem of homeless tent camping in Portland.
Right.
As part of this, we went out and spoke to 100 people living in tents, surveyed them to really get a better understanding of the problem, and now we're discussing possible solutions.
Right, and I want to point out, because it was an idea that our investigative team had, we also had a local research firm conduct a survey of Portlanders who are housed about kind of their perceptions surrounding homelessness, and that's primarily what we're seeing from our comments here. A lot of you really compassionate. Some of you were touched by the stories that you saw in the documentary. A lot of you are really angry.